Guys, buckle in. I do not think you're ready for this case. I'm not even ready for this case. I'm blown away by the amount of mystery and lies and just all of the information that surrounds this case. I do not think you're ready for it. If you guys are new here, hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Amber Rose and I primarily make true crime content, mainly focusing on Jane and John Doe cases, although sometimes I do like to sprinkle some personal vlogs here and there. This is a series I started called Missing Mondays, and I'm starting with the state of Alabama and eventually ending with the state of Wyoming. Today we will be covering a Jane Doe case from the state of Arkansas, and like I stated, it is going to be a wild ride, so get ready. Before we dive in, guys, I do want to put a disclaimer that not only is this going to be a longer video for sure, but we are going to be discussing themes of domestic violence, homelessness, and prostitution. So if any of those things are things that you are not comfortable hearing or discussing, feel free to click off, and I'm sure there will be a different video for you coming shortly. The Jane Doe that we are going to be discussing today is known as Dorado Jane Doe, although as you will come to find out shortly, she has many different names. Our Jane Doe was discovered on July 10th, 1991 in room 121 at the Whitehall Motel in El Dorado, Arkansas. Now, this motel has since been demolished since the time of her case, but at the time it was really well known in the area for prostitution and illicit drug use, so it was definitely a hot spot for crime. Her autopsy concluded that she had died from a single gunshot wound to the head, although she did have a broken neck as well. Unfortunately, before the time of her death, she was well known in local hospitals for being treated for severe beatings and domestic violence related issues. When it came to figuring out who the killer was, it was pretty obvious, cut and dry, straight to the point. It was her former boyfriend, James McGulphin. Apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Shortly after the murder of our Jane Doe, he turned himself in and was subsequently charged with first-degree murder and second-degree battery. Our Jane Doe and James McGulphin had met in Dallas, Texas before making their way to Arkansas, but to this day, James claims that her murder was a suicide and that she killed herself. What we know about the day of her murder and what happened is that shortly before she was murdered, she was living with her friend Andrea Cooksey, who was also a dancer at a club with our Jane Doe. Cooksey claimed that McGulphin had called our Jane Doe on the phone and offered her money, and that she was planning on using this money to buy gifts for her kids. She had frequently talked about having one child or two child at multiple different times with multiple different people, although to this day this has never been confirmed. Neither her children or the father of her alleged children have come forth to identify her, so it's really not known if she did or did not have children. According to Andrea Cooksey and many other residents of El Dorado, Arkansas, our Jane Doe was named Mercedes, and this was the name that she always went by in this area. One very large theme that you're going to see throughout this video is a lot of lies and misinformation and false identities. This is very much so reoccurring throughout her timeline and throughout this story, but we're going to revisit that shortly. Right before her murder took place, quite a few witnesses stated that they had seen the couple arguing in the parking lot of this motel. And then another witness by the name of Roy Charles Menon stated that he had come to the motel to pick up his cassette tapes that James McGulphin had borrowed, and our Jane Doe was the one who answered the door. He said that she seemed very flustered, very upset, and that she had told Menon to deal with James before she walked right out the door. According to Menon, right after our Jane Doe walked out of the room, James McGulphin followed right behind her. He stated that not only did James McGulphin hit her, he grabbed her by the hair and said, "Get back inside, bitch," before dragging her inside, shutting the door, and arguing some more. Now, the couple argued for only a few more moments before Roy Charles Menon stated he heard a gunshot, and this can also be confirmed by Andrea Cooksey, as at the time of the gunshot, she just happened to be walking past the motel and she heard it too, which is very coincidental because she knew our Jane Doe. Doe. But anyway, Menon ran right inside the room where he said he saw our Jane Doe lying on the floor, and then James McAlpin fled the scene, getting into his car and driving away, which was confirmed by another witness. I feel like before we go any further into her case, I think it's really important to go over the details of her life and what we know about her, because there is a mountain of information and it all is related in one way or another. I honestly have to say that when I was researching this case, it honestly felt like I was researching a murder trial and not a Jane Doe case, simply because there is just so much information about our Jane Doe. There is a plethora of photos, there's a full history of places she lived, people she knew. There was a bunch of her belongings that were recovered from the scene. It was just really bizarre. You don't ever see Jane Doe or John Doe cases like this. Normally, the reason that they are a Jane or John Doe is because of a lack of information, but it's honestly quite the opposite with this case. So the first really interesting thing about this case is that, as I stated earlier, a lot of witnesses at the scene stated that the name of our Jane Doe was Mercedes. They were telling the cops, that's Mercedes, he killed Mercedes. Andrea had told them, that's my friend Mercedes. So when they brought all of her belongings back to the police station, they were quite shocked when they found a social security card and an ID with the name Cheryl Ann Wick on it. So they had assumed that possibly the name Mercedes was a name that she went by because she was a dancer and she worked in sex work. A lot of the time, sex workers do have different names or aliases. So the investigators began the treacherous task of having to contact Cheryl Ann Wick's family and let them know of her passing. They located Cheryl's family living in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and after notifying the family of Cheryl's death, you can only imagine the complete shock when the investigators were told that Cheryl Ann Wick was very much alive and well and was sitting right next to her parents while this phone call was taking place. According to Cheryl, who was confirmed to be very much so alive, she had had her ID and social security card stolen while she was working at a club in Minneapolis called Party Time, and she just had never gotten around to reporting it or replacing these items. So it is thought that our Jane Doe had stolen her identity and possibly also worked at this same club at one point. But along with this information, they now were at a dead end when it came to her identity, and that is how she gained the name Dorado Jane Doe. Some of the belongings that were brought into evidence from our Jane Doe were a journal with plenty of legible journal entries, a Bible with some names written in it, a bunch of snapshot photos of our Jane Doe from various points in her life, a flyer from Boyd Sound Studio in Wiley, Texas, and menus from various restaurants and venues such as Phillips Waterside, The Raven, Worrell Brothers, and another one from a place called Norfolk, Virginia. One of her journal entries recounted some people called Gail and Tyrone, a couple who she had once lived with at one point, possibly with James McAlpin, and there were also plenty of entries about her boyfriend James McAlpin, most of them not very nice. As I previously stated, there were a bunch of names written inside the Bible that was recovered. The names were Willie James Stroud, Sharon Yvette Stroud, LaDonna Elaine Stroud, Johnny Lee Stroud, Viola Elizabeth Ross Stroud, Donna Jean Stroud, Bobby Jean Stroud, and Willie James Danstler. Now, after more investigation, it was found that the names of these people were actually a name of a family who was living in Irving, Texas at the time. They did contact the family and they found out that our Jane Doe had lived with them for some period of time, although they made it very clear they didn't know anything about her personal information, her personal details, or her past. One source also mentioned that they thought James McAlpin might have been related to this family, but it was not confirmed. As I had stated earlier, our Jane Doe went by numerous different aliases, and these are her most common ones: Kelly Carr, Cheryl Ann Wick, Mercedes, Sharon Wiley, Shannon Wiley, Cheryl Kaufman, and Helen Stenner. It's also believed that James McAlpin had a few aliases of his own, and this included Ice McAlpin, Mark McAlpin, and Julian Starr. Now, along with all these different names that she went by, numerous different people came forward to say that they had been told a varying story of her past. And let me tell you, some of these are wild, but pretty much everyone who came forward had a different version of events and a very different story from the next person. Some of her acquaintances stated that she was from Florida, where other people believed that she was from Oklahoma. Some people she told she had one child, other people she told she had multiple children. And at one point, she even told her friend she'd given birth in in a homeless shelter, but that her child was taken by CPS. The homeless shelter in question has since been shut down, and unfortunately the records from this establishment are not available, so we are unable to confirm if this line of events is actually true. Other stories that she often told people were that she was in the witness protection program, that her father was in the mafia, also that she had a rap sheet, and that she was wanted for a bank robbery on the East Coast. She was known to frequently volunteer at the Salvation Army in El Dorado, Arkansas, and she had told multiple people that she was unable to get her daughter back from CPS because she was living under a false identity, which, as we know, is obviously true, or else I wouldn't be making this video. The authorities were able to compile a list of areas that it was believed she may have lived at one point or another. This would be Dallas, Texas, which is where she did meet James McAlpin. Shreveport, Louisiana. This was confirmed by her friend Andrea Cooksey. Little Rock, Arkansas, which was confirmed by some people who she worked with in that area. And of course, El Dorado, Arkansas, which is where she was living at the time of her death. Just to make things a little bit easier, I am going to go through a confirmed timeline of things we know for sure happened leading up to her death. In early 1990, she was living by the name Cheryl Ann Wick and was working at a KFC restaurant in Dallas, Texas. In August of 1990, she was living with a boyfriend. It's unconfirmed if this boyfriend was James McAlpin or not, but regardless, she was also living with the couple she had written about in her journal, Gail and Tyrone. On December 31st of 1990, she was arrested in Dallas, Texas for prostitution, and she was arrested again on January 26th of 1991, and then again on February 8th of 1991 for public lewdness, and this again was in Dallas, Texas. Her final documented arrest came in May of 1991, where she was booked for passing bad checks. Now, in June of 1991, she was living with Andrea Cooksey because, according to her, our Jane Doe had told her that she'd gotten into some type of trouble in Shreveport, Louisiana, and that's how she ended up in El Dorado, Arkansas. And then, as we know, in July of 1991, she was murdered by her boyfriend. Going forward with her criminal arrest, our Jane Doe did have quite the rap sheet, and shortly after her death, a letter was discovered that was passed on to the FBI from the police. This letter stated that our Jane Doe was 24-year-old Kelly Lee Carr, and that she was wanted for bank robbery on the East Coast and in Virginia, which is a story that she had told people before, although she didn't mention that her name was Kelly Lee Carr. She had allegedly confessed this information after a previous arrest of hers, and that is why the police did pass this letter on to the FBI. Going back to her killer, or her boyfriend if you want to call him, James McAlpin, he also had quite the lengthy criminal record, which is no surprise, especially because of the amount of domestic violence he was accused of. And most of these charges were for battery, assault, and possession of a firearm. After he was charged with our Jane Doe's death, he wanted $4,000 to confess the real identity of our Jane Doe, which obviously didn't happen, although he did come forth with other information for free. McAlpin claimed that our Jane Doe had a sister and a mother in the state of Florida, and that she had been working as a prostitute since the age of 16. Now, other sources state that she might have been a runaway as early as age 11 and then had been thrown into sex work to survive, but regardless, it's pretty safe to say that she left home at a pretty young age and ended up in the sex working industry. McAlpin said she had told him that she had fallen in love with a man who ended up pimping her out, and that is how she ended up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Texas. Now, this is the area in which she met James McAlpin, and he would end up doing the exact same thing to her. He stated that at the time that they met, he was 26 years old, but that our Jane Doe stated she was older, which some people speculate would make her around the ages of 27 or 28 at the time of her death. He also stated that she had avoided being pimped out in Mexico after she started a relationship with a man named JJ, and then another relationship with a man named Tyrone, although it's unconfirmed if this Tyrone is the same Tyrone that she was living with at one point. She was known to be a topless dancer in multiple different cities, some of which being Little Rock, Arkansas, and of course Dallas, Texas, but also possibly in Minneapolis, Minnesota, as that is where the real Sharon Ann Wick was working morning when her ID and her social security card were stolen. But you guys, this is where things get even crazier. James McAlpin claims that our Jane Doe was friends with the famous Fort Worth trio. Now, if you're into true crime, you probably know who these girls are, but the Fort Worth trio are a group of 3 girls who were kidnapped from the South Shopping Center in Dallas, Texas on December 23rd of 1974, and they have never been found to this day. Their names were Julie Ann Mosley, Lisa Renee Wilson, and Mary Rachel Trillica. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. He also stated that the 4 girls grew up together in captivity and that Julie in particular was already deceased as she had died during childbirth. Now, quite honestly, I think we can all come to the conclusion that this most likely is not true, that our Jane Doe did not know these girls, but regardless, our Jane Doe still has no identity and the Fort Worth trio have still never been found to this day. Interestingly enough though, our Jane Doe was also said to be connected to another criminal case. On November 12th of 1988, a truck driver by the name of Dwayne Mcquirkendale was found murdered. Now, witnesses said that they saw a white female along with 2 other males, one white and one black, driving away in a brown Ford Pinto. And although it's never been confirmed if she did or did not have anything to do with the murder of this truck driver, another version of events that she told numerous different people is that she was known to lure truck drivers at various truck stops and then rob them, and she stated that at one point one of these robberies ended in murder. I could honestly talk for days regarding the history behind our Jane Doe and all of the different theories and different pieces of information that has come forth about what she possibly had done, where she had lived, where she had worked, etc. But I would probably be here for days. Now, at the time of her death, she was estimated to be anywhere from the age of 18 to 30 years old. She was quite tall. She was in between 5'10" and 5'11" tall, and she weighed between 150 and 162 pounds at the time of her death. She had blue eyes and blonde hair, although some sources stated that she had naturally brown hair for which she dyed blonde, and other sources say that she had strawberry blonde hair naturally, but she dyed it blonde. I personally am more inclined to believe that she was naturally a strawberry blonde, only because if you look at her autopsy photos, which I will not be obviously putting on the screen for you guys, but her autopsy photos show that she clearly has some strawberry blonde hair, and that paired with the naturally occurring freckles all over her skin and her skin tone, I'm definitely more inclined to believe that she was naturally a strawberry blonde instead of a brown haired girl. But regardless, she mostly had her hair blonde in all of her photos. Now, at the time of her death, she did have 3 piercings on her right ear, 2 piercings on her left ear, and she had a noticeable scar or birthmark underneath her left breast. This varies by which source you look into. At the time of her death, she was wearing acid wash jeans, a black belt, a white t-shirt, white ankle length socks, and white tennis shoes. She also had on a gold colored chain bracelet on her right arm, and she had 2 hair ties in her hair. Dental records, a DNA profile, and fingerprints were also taken from our Jane Doe. Now, before I talk about the massive update that this case recently had, I do want to quickly go over all of her rule outs and one possible theory of what her identity might have been. Now, unbelievably, her case has upwards of 60 rule outs. One source stated 56, another source stated 52, but regardless, that is by far the most rule outs I have ever seen in a Jane or John Doe case. I do really think this is in part because of all of the different aliases that she had. She could quite literally be anybody, but I still just think that after 30 years and having almost 60 different rule outs, it's insane that we still don't know her real identity. I'm not going to go through and say all of them for you just because obviously there are a lot of different women who were confirmed not to be her, but I will link them all in the down bar below if you want to kind of do your own research and go through the list of women that they did look into. to, but I do want to talk about one possible rule out that has not been confirmed yet. I don't know if I necessarily believe it, but I do think it's very interesting, so I did want to share it with you guys. There is a theory floating around the internet that our Jane Doe could be that of Christina Lynn Carter, who was a 3-year-old girl who went missing in September of 1973. Now, prior to the disappearance of this 3-year-old girl, her mother, who was named Janet Calhoun Carter, got a divorce from her husband and was said to be having an affair before she then disappeared with Christina. Janet Calhoun Carter, her body was found only a month later in the Appalachian Mountains of all places on October 7th of 1973, but to this day, Christina Lynn Carter has never been found. Now, what interests me about this specific case is two different things. The first thing being the age. Now, if Christina was 3 years old in 1973 when she went missing, that would have made her born in the year 1970. So if she really was our Jane Doe, she would have been 21 years old at the time of her death, which does fit into the age range of what they estimated our Jane Doe to be between the ages of 18 and 30. But aside from the age estimation, her name is another very interesting point of this case. So typically when a person is choosing an alias, they will choose a name that closely resembles their given name because it makes it easier for them to remember this name when they are stating it or giving it to other people. So in this case, if our Doe really was Christina Lynn Carter, all of her aliases do closely resemble the name Christina. So for example, our Jane Doe most notably went by the names Sharon, Shannon, and Cheryl. All of these have that like CH, SH, sh kind of sound that a Christina would give off. Now, secondly, her last name Carter. One of her most notably used last name aliases is Carr, which Carter shortened equals Carr. Aside from that, she also went by the name Mercedes when she was living in El Dorado, Arkansas, and Mercedes is a brand of a car. So I know it's really far-fetched, but they do all link together in one way or another. But you guys, the resemblance does not stop there. Now in 2019, so only about 3 years ago, genetic genealogy was able to track down a second cousin of our Jane Doe. The DNA Doe Project was able to provide GEDmatch, which is a really well-known genetic genealogy company, the DNA of our Jane Doe. They are the company that is most notably known for very recently identifying the Golden State Killer. In January of 2019, they received their first DNA hit, which led them to a woman living in Alabama by the name of Christina Tilford, whom detectives state is the first link that they found to our Jane Doe. They contacted Christina Tilford on Facebook, and since then, they were actually able to identify that the father of our Jane Doe is a direct descendant of a couple named Daniel Wood and Mammy Carter. Yes, you heard me right, Carter, as in Christina Lynn Carter. Now, this specific couple lived in Virginia and had 9 children between the two of them, one of which being our Jane Doe's father. Another link to this case being that our Jane Doe was wanted in Virginia on the East Coast for a bank robbery. Probably just a coincidence, but I did want to throw it in there. Now, Daniel Wood and Mammy Carter are the great-great-grandparents of Christina Tilford, the woman who GEDmatch was able to identify as a second cousin to our Jane Doe. Unfortunately, Christina Tilford did not recognize our Jane Doe, but she did state that she definitely had a family resemblance. Christina Tilford stated that she had shared her DNA only about a year before all of this happened and that she never expected anything like this to go down. She simply just wanted to find a little more information about her family roots and her family history, and that she's really shocked over everything that has been happening. And that leads us to where we are today. So unfortunately, there have been no other updates in this case, and our Jane Doe is still unidentified to this day. But I think it's very obvious to state that we are so unbelievably close to knowing the actual identity of our Jane Doe. I mean, we quite literally know everything we could know about her, even her grandparents' names, but we still just don't know her real identity. But I do hope in good time that genetic genealogy will be able to identify her and we will know who she is very soon. Now, if you guys guys did make it all the way through this video, please let me know what you think. I told you it was going to be a long one. I told you it was going to be crazy, and I'm so interested to see what you guys think of our Jane Doe's case, because I'm still left in awe after doing all that research and filming this. I honestly don't think I'm ever going to come across a Jane Doe who has this much mystery or information and is still unknown. But that is going to be it for me today, guys. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, and make sure to share it so we can get the case of our Jane Doe out there and hopefully be able to identify her. And with that, I will see you guys next week with an all new Missing Mondays. Bye.